Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Nina von Diller-Walden, the Managing Director of Chai Mitzvah, the Resource Center for Jewish Engagement. Chai Mitzvah, the sponsor of Scholar Circle, is a Jewish engagement program that partners with over 700 organizations and has worked with over 9,000 individuals in small group learning. We have over 20 curricula tailored for small group conversation for teens and adults, lay or professionally led. To learn more, visit our website, chaimitzvah.org. The Scholar Circle hosts lectures by prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics relating to Israel and the Jewish community, geared towards rabbis, educators, and lay leaders who are charged with explaining the complex issues which the Jewish community is facing. To that end, each lecture will have a resource sheet that will be sent to you after the lecture. A recording of each lecture will be accessible on our website and shared with you through email. Our scholar tonight is Dr. Andrew Pessin, professor of philosophy at Connecticut College and campus bureau editor for the Algemeiner. His many books include Anti-Zionism on Campus, Poisoning the Wells, Anti-Semitism in Contemporary America, and The Jewish God Question. Long ago, he enjoyed some moments of fame portraying the genius on the David Letterman show. Before I welcome our scholar, a couple of housekeeping items. To submit questions, please use the Q&A button on your screen. Q&A will be held at about 40 minutes into the lecture, but you can submit questions anytime throughout. The lecture recording will be sent to your email in a few days and will also be available at chaimitzvah.org. Now to Dr. Andrew Pessin.
Thank you, Nina, and thank you, Simon, for that welcome. Let me go ahead and share that so we can get going. Welcome, everybody, tonight. It's nice to be here, and I do appreciate those folks who've made it and those who plan to watch the recording at their convenience. It's a somber topic we have to deal with tonight. I wish we didn't have to deal with this topic, but it's, I think, imperative, and we will deal with it. Who am I? Nina gave me a nice introduction. I am a philosophy professor. I also am the campus bureau editor for the Algemeiner, which is a wonderful news source that focuses on Jews in Israel. And I recommend you sign up for the daily newsletter. Staying informed on what's going on is step number one towards doing something about it, especially with respect to the campus. So algemeiner.com, free daily newsletter. Please do sign up for that. I got involved in this business starting sort of seriously about 9 years ago or so. I had my own experience where I was targeted for supporting Israel, and that experience opened my eyes to the fact that, to put it boldly and baldly, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Once you've seen that, you can't unsee it. And I've been working for the Algemeiner largely since then, and keeping an eye on the campus scene and seeing how anti-Zionism has evolved and morphed over the past 9 years. I have to say that the response to October 7th on campuses didn't surprise me, as I've seen the trajectory going in that direction, although, of course, it still was just shocking and brutal to witness it coming to be. Lastly, in addition to what I've just mentioned, I also write novels, and I wanted to mention my last couple novels. The previous one was called Nevergreen, which is about how crazy campuses have become and the deleterious impact on the Jews, unfortunately quite timely. And my most recent novel, just out now, is called Bright College Years, which is about how campuses used to be before they became sort of crazed self-mockeries of themselves. So please do check those out. My website, andrewpessin.com, has full information. So here we are tonight, setting the record straight, dispelling myths surrounding Israel, or a slightly stronger title, refuting the lies about Israel. We will begin tonight. This is part one. We won't finish tonight. There'll be at least 2 parts, maybe even spill over into 3. We'll examine some of the major lies told about Israel on campuses, and then not only refute each one, but show that in almost every case, the reverse is true. Either Israel actually does the opposite of what's being claimed, or in many of the examples, it's Israel's enemies that are guilty of these charges. And we'll take a look, we'll go through the list of them in just a moment. That they are so many, and you know these terms: genocide, ethnic cleansing, settler colonialism, occupation, apartheid, etc. That there are so many lies, that they are so big and so widespread shows that this isn't just about misinformation or ignorance or inadequate nuance in a complex situation, nor is it a matter of critiquing various Israeli policies or practices, which of course is a totally fine thing to do, but it's a deliberate bad faith campaign to dehumanize and delegitimize and demonize Israeli Jews, Israelis in general, Jews in general, and to portray them as the absolute epitome of evil, which then justifies boycotting them, persecuting them, attacking them, and even in the case of October 7th and the campus response to October 7th, it justifies killing them. And that's what we were dealing with here. And there's many things to do in response to it, but thing number one is to be able to respond to and refute the charges. If this strategy sounds familiar, telling lies to dehumanize, to pave the way for attacking, persecuting, and even killing, it should sound familiar. The phrase, the big lie, is fairly famous. This is a quote from Hitler, Mein Kampf, his famous work. All this was inspired by the principle, he says, which is quite true within itself, that in the big lie, there is always a certain force of credibility. People are prone to accept a big lie. It's so outrageous, they think people wouldn't say it unless it were true. It would never come into their heads to fabricate colossal untruths, and they would not believe others could have the impudence to distort the truth so infamously. Even though the facts which prove this to be so may be brought clearly to their mind, so you can show the truth to them afterwards, they'll still doubt and waver and continue to think there must be some other explanation besides the truth. For the grossly impudent lie always leaves traces behind it, even after it has been nailed down, a fact which is known to all expert liars in this world and to all who conspire together in the art of lying. This is, of course, exactly what we're seeing in the campus campaign. We also have this quite famous quote attributed to Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. It's not clear if he ever actually said this, but it's widely attributed to him, and it's the kind of thing he would say if he didn't actually. He says, if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. The lie can be maintained only for such a time as the state can shield people from the political, economic, or military consequences of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all its powers to repress dissent, where truth is the mortal enemy of the lie. And truth, by extension, is the greatest enemy of the state. So the Goebbels quote at least yields the slightly optimistic thought that the truth can set people free. The truth is dangerous because it will take away the lie. Um, but the track record more likely supports the Hitler quote. Even when the truth is exposed, people still feel the impact of the lie, find themselves gripped by it, prone to believe it, especially when that lie is told about the Jews. Uh, Nevertheless, we will do our best to present the mortal enemy of the lie, namely the truth, and it's at least one weapon in our toolkit. What are the lies? This is a bit of a long paragraph, but this is the false narrative. This is the anti-Israel narrative that is spread all over campuses. There once was a country called Palestine, existing from time immemorial, filled mostly with Palestinians and a few Jews who got along nicely. Then the Jews started arriving from Europe in the 20th century, starting the problems, committing genocide against many Palestinians and expelling most of the rest, ethnic cleansing, as part of their project of settler colonialism, thus coming to occupy Palestinian land, first in 48, then in 67, and building illegal settlements. Those Palestinians who remained in Israel and their descendants are kept subjugated today under apartheid, a political system that allegedly reflects Jewish supremacy. Those who were expelled to the West Bank now live under the crippling occupation, while those who were expelled to Gaza are or were kept in an open-air prison. All of the above reveals that Zionism is racism, and resistance to Zionism by any means necessary is entirely justified, including the rapes, torture, and massacre of October 7th. You could hardly fit more lies into one paragraph. Every single sentence, every single clause is a lie here, but this is the false narrative, and this is the dominant narrative. If you ask all the anti-Israel people on all of the major campuses, what's your story? This is the story that they will tell. And because they tell it so frequently and so consistently and so loudly, even the larger mostly silent majority, the students who aren't so invested in hating Israel, they're going to be absorbing these lies. And by the time they graduate, they may not remember any of the details, but they're going to walk away from college thinking, boy, those Jews are really pretty evil. They do a lot of evil things. So no, you can hardly fit more lies into a single paragraph. We won't get through all of them tonight. As I mentioned, there will be a part 2, so stay tuned for the scheduling of that. Our goal is to get through what we get through in the 35 or so minutes that we now have ahead of us. My goal also is to be thorough here, detailed. That means a recording will be available. I think it's important to have the facts. Part of the strategy, of course, is it's easy to say the lie, and these are such big, dangerous words, but to refute the lies properly typically involves careful, painstaking work, footnotes, facts. Takes a long time. You have to be careful about it. And by, the expression, by the time the truth is just it's just tying its shoes when the lie has gone around the world 3 times, right? So we're always behind the curve. Nevertheless, we have to have this material. So let's begin with lie number 1. There once was a country called Palestine, existing from time immemorial, filled mostly with Palestinians and a few Jews who got along nicely. That last clause is there to help emphasize the fact that the troubles and problems are all the Jews' fault, and all Zionism's fault. In short, of course, the response to this is no, this is not true. Let's start with the name Palestine. Scholars have 2 major theories about where the word Palestine initially came from. It first appears in a Greek history text several centuries BCE. So we're talking 2,300 years ago or so. There it refers either to the in the Greek history text, it's the Greek word for invader. I'm sorry, got that wrong. It's the Greek word for wrestlers. The other theory is that it's a Hebrew word from the Bible for the Philistines. The Philistines were an ancient seafaring people from the Aegean Sea, and the word means the invaders. They invaded basically from Greece, right? So let's think about both of those. Either it's the Hebrew word for invaders, in which case the word Palestine has a Jewish origin because it's a Hebrew term, or it's this Greek term for wrestlers. And why would the Greek term for wrestlers be applied to this land over there? Because Yisrael is, of course, wrestled with God. The Jews are the wrestlers in questions. So either way, the term Palestinian is of Jewish origin. It's either a Hebrew word referring to the Philistines or it's a Greek word referring to the Jews. That already calls into question this whole narrative. A very brief history, and of course, it's important to know the full history, anyone who wants to defend Israel from the charges. But very briefly, famously, the Roman Empire, renamed the province of Judea Syria Palestina after conquering the Jews for good in the Bar Kokhba revolt, after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 136 in the Common Era in the 2nd century, doing so allegedly to erase the Jewish signature on the land. And then Palestine became a largely European name for the region, not used by Arabs or Muslims. From this point onwards, from the 2nd century onwards, there never was an independent country called Palestine, much less one inhabited by the Arab people known today as Palestinians. What's certainly not the case is the idea that the Jews came to this pre-existing Arab country and took it over. In fact, Palestine was not even a unified region under the Ottoman Empire. The northern half of the country was of one province with Damascus and widely thought of as southern Syria, while the southern half was a completely distinct province. And the whole region only came to have well-defined borders with the British Mandate of 1922. Most of the Arabs at the time, in the 1920s, rejected both the name and the borders, seeing them as a colonialist imposition on them. It was basically Christian Europe which referred to the region as Palestine, and not the Arabs in the overall region. As far as Palestinian identity goes, no one identified as Palestinian in the sense of Palestinian Arab until approximately the 1950s. The region had a great deal of immigration in the 19th century from all over the Ottoman Empire, and it consisted of a wide mix of different people, Arabs and non-Arabs. There was no single people and no ethnic identity of Palestinian. And indeed, with respect to Arab and other immigration, take a look at some common Palestinian last names. Al-Masri, the Egyptian, Al-Mughrabi, the Moroccan, Al-Jazair, the Algerian, and so forth. Many common Palestinian last names indicate where they came from in recent decades or centuries. And you see they come from all over, including India and Al-Kurdi, the Kurd, and Iran, and so forth. In my view, they became a people sometime after 1948. There's lots of debate about this sort of issue, but in my view, they became a people as a result of the shared experience of what they call the Nakba, the catastrophe, the foundation of Israel. But this happened after the establishment of Israel, after the success of Zionism. There was not a pre-existing people prior to that time. The other part of this lie, that everything was copacetic, lovely and peaceful until the Jews came. Well, there's a long history of persecution of the Jews all over the world, as we know, but including in the Middle East and North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and so forth. Here's just a select list of episodes from 1790 to 1844. I haven't been able to check every single one of these, but there's a bunch on here I'm familiar with. So these are documenting real things: destructions, pogroms, persecutions, massacres, etc., 1790 to 1844. In fact, in my notes, the list goes all the way up until the 1900. So this was not a peaceful time for the Jews. Jews were basically, at best, second-class citizens, and at worst, persecuted and oppressed second-class citizens throughout the Ottoman Empire, throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. So no, there was not a peaceful harmony between Jews and Arabs of this region until the Zionists showed up. That's lie number one. Lie number two. Then the Jews started arriving from Europe in the 20th century. This lie is, of course, designed to erase the whole long history of Jewish presence in this land, and therefore erase the foundational right of the Jews to live in this land. And it's worth mentioning the idea that the Jews have the right to live in this land does not preclude the possibility or the idea that Arabs might also have the right to live in this land, right? But the anti-Israel narrative is being careful to ignore and paper over the long Jewish history, which gives the Jews the right to be in this land. This lie is maybe less a lie than a deliberate omission, leaving out that long history. There was, of course, significant Jewish presence in this land going back 3,000 years. I'm sure most of this audience is familiar with that. And the Jews had as much right to live here and be here as any other peoples. Brief Jewish history. Again, it's important to know the whole history. And by the way, it's important that we teach our children the whole history and teach our children all these facts. They are arriving on campuses, unfortunately, woefully underprepared for the assault that they are facing on so many campuses. Very briefly, of course, Jews had sovereignty or autonomy or dominant presence in this region from approximately 1200 BCE, which is when the Exodus, if it's a historical event, occurred, until the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt, as I mentioned earlier, in 136 of the Common Era. 1300 years, 13 centuries, this is a Jewish part of the world. After the destruction of the temple, and again after Bar Kokhba, many Jews were sent into exile, the diaspora as it's called. But even so, Jews remained, many Jews remained. The center of the religion shifted from Jerusalem to Yavne, and of course the Jerusalem Talmud was compiled by the 5th century in the Common Era. Jews never left. They were still there in significant numbers. That fact isn't so widely appreciated. On a regular basis through the centuries, Jews made aliyah. They returned, sometimes in small numbers, sometimes in larger numbers, continuously over the course of those 2,000 years. Jews were in fact already a majority in Jerusalem by 1850 or so, and perhaps in one or two other cities there, long before the modern Zionist movement. And Jews returned to the land of Israel, not just from Europe, but from many places in the diaspora, including from the vast expanses of the Ottoman Empire. The picture, of course, they want to convey to you is that the modern Zionist movement, starting with Herzl in 1896 and then really taking off in the early 20th century, they want to give you this picture of white European colonialists coming in and kicking out the native inhabitants. That's the crucial part of that false narrative. Um, it's true, the kernel of truth there is, of course, there was significant Jewish immigration in the early 20th century from the Zionist movement and from Europe, both Eastern and later Western, Eastern and later Western Europe, particularly fueled, of course, by the 1930s and the 1940s and the Holocaust. But the immigration began earlier than that. In the 1880s. There was already an immigration movement. And of course, as well, in the years immediately leading up to and following the establishment of Israel in 1948, the Arab countries expelled most of their Jews, most of whom ended up in Israel, to the point where the Mizrahi Jews are the majority in Israel and have been for some time. So it is not a bunch of white Europeans coming in. It's Jews returning from all parts of the world, Jews of all colors and races, of course. Um, in fact, Israel is, in today's language, part of the narrative is, of course, white supremacy is the greatest evil in Western progressive mindset. And so they see Israelis as white supremacist oppressors of the Palestinians, people of color, conveniently ignoring the fact that the majority of Israelis are Mizrahi, not white at all. And even the Ashkenazis who came from Europe, amongst the reasons they suffered such persecution and pogroms was they were considered not white. So it's important to keep that all in mind. We move to lie 3. That was some 20th century history there. We move to lie 3. Now we're getting to the big ones and the important ones. These are the ones that dehumanize the Jews, paint them to be irreparably evil to the bone, and therefore marked for harassment, boycott, persecution, and ultimately murder. The Jews, they say in their lie, came into this country, started arriving in the 20th century, committing genocide against many Palestinians. Right? So the genocide charge, 2 parts of the genocide charge for us tonight. There is the pre-1948 that they committed genocide in order to establish the state. And now, of course, couldn't be more timely with the charge that during the current war with Hamas, that Israel is carrying out genocide against the Gazans, against the Arab Palestinians. Please do remember that the term genocide has a very clear meaning. It is the destruction or attempted destruction of a whole people. According to the 1948 International Genocide Convention, genocide constitutes or is constituted by, quote, acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, end quote. So that's the charge against Israel, that it is doing that, did that in the 1948 and is doing that today. This one is most easily refuted by looking at the numbers. So let's just take the numbers. I'll mention the numbers, and this is nicely visualized in these charts. The Arab population in Israel in 1948 was 156,000. The Arab population in 2024 is 2.6 million. The Palestinian population in the territories in 1960 was about 1.1 million. In 2020, it was 5.1 million. And the Palestinian population in Gaza in 1948 was about 250,000. In 2023, 2024, it's 2.2 million plus, which, by the way, is a rate of growth triple the world average. And to see these visually, you'll just, without looking at the specific numbers, you can get a sense here of the fact that the Arab Palestinian population has grown dramatically in all of these years. You might also notice, if you look carefully, that in both the West Bank and Gaza, Arab Palestinian populations start to go up dramatically after Israel captures them in 1967. Why? Because Israel built infrastructure, including water and sewer. They modernized healthcare. They built hospitals. They established schools and universities, all the things that promote public health in all sorts of ways. So the population has not only grown dramatically in these decades, it's grown dramatically because of actions that Israel undertook when it captured those particular territories, which is exactly the opposite of what genocide would look like. If genocide is the destruction of the people, the numbers should go down rather than, in fact, mushroom. We all know, unfortunately, what genocide looks like. It looks like this: population at a certain peak, and then after the acts of genocide, the population precipitously declines. This is, of course, the Nazi Holocaust that we have here, which it is worth pointing out that the Palestinian leader at the time, the Mufti, collaborated with the Nazis. Some even suggest that he gave Hitler the idea for the final solution. I don't know if scholars agree on that, but in any case, he spent the war years in Berlin, and he attempted to spread the Holocaust and the final solution to the Middle East. So this is what genocide looks like, what Hitler did, what the Mufti, the Palestinian leader, collaborated with and attempted to further, and of course what Hamas did on October 7th, not to mention they stated clearly in their charter their goal to murder every Jew on earth. They state it repeatedly, publicly on all of their social media. They have said multiple times that October 7th is just the beginning. They're going to repeat October 7th again and again. Mass murder directed at non-combatants with the intention to destroy the people is genocide. It's not Israel that's responsible for the genocide. It is, of course, the other side. Coming up to today's war, the current war between Israel and Hamas. This is a charge that has been levied against Israel since literally the day after October 7th, before Israel even did anything, before the massacre was even finished. Anti-Israel activists on campuses and elsewhere were not only rallying to celebrate, but calling to condemn Israeli genocide against Gaza even before it had started. In the first days, once Israel did begin its response, from day one, they were complaining, objecting, condemning it as genocide. And add one more point. When was the last time a genocide occurred where the party that was allegedly the victim of the genocide was offered multiple ceasefire opportunities and rejected them, as Hamas did yet again today with the latest Israeli offer? So those two facts, the fact that they've been labeling it genocide literally from before day one of Israel's response, and the fact that they repeatedly turned down ceasefire offers, is a sign of the dishonesty of this particular charge. So is Israel committing genocide in Gaza? It is true in the course of the war, in which incidentally Hamas is fighting back and killing Israeli soldiers. That's often overlooked. They like to portray it as Israel, it's like just a one-way assault. They're going in, mowing people down. There's actually a war going on and Hamas is fighting back. It's true that Israeli defense forces have killed a significant number of people in Gaza. That is not to be denied. But it's also true that if Israel wanted to kill literally every single person in Gaza today, that is to say, actually commit genocide, it has the capacity. It could do that. But of course, it doesn't want to do that and has never wanted to do that and never remotely done anything that even looks like that. And let us note, absolutely, every civilian casualty is a tragedy. But war is literally impossible without civilian casualties. And no one has ever just equated unavoidable civilian casualties with a genocide charge, except when it comes to the Jewish state, only when the Jews do it. And the reality is that it's easily demonstrable that this is nothing resembling an actual genocide. And so therefore, the genocide charge is a perfect example of this big lie, so far removed from reality, to paint the Israelis and the Jews as demonic people worthy to be eliminated. First, how many has Israel killed? So the official numbers as of the last day or so were about 32,000. But first point, right? One simply cannot trust these numbers. No one's denying a significant number of people have died, but one cannot trust these numbers. The numbers come directly from Hamas, which is, of course, one of the parties in the conflict. And there have been many articles already showing that these numbers are clearly being fabricated. We won't go through the detailed arguments for them, but just if you look at the article in the upper left by Abraham Weiner, he's a professor of statistics at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, who's done a statistical analysis last month showing that the numbers are being fabricated. The numbers all come from the Gazan Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas. And even the Gazan Health Ministries breaks their numbers into two categories. There's numbers they're allegedly counting in the hospitals, and then numbers that are reported to them by trusted media sources, which are, of course, Hamas, right? And so Hamas has infiltrated this entire process. We already know there have been numerous cases where they were simply caught lying about the number of casualties. Most famously, the hospital example back in October, Al-Ahli Hospital. They claimed that Israel had bombed it and killed 500 people, and it was immediately shown worldwide, although it took a while for the New York Times to come to believe it in the Washington Post, but it was immediately shown that Israel had not bombed that hospital, that in fact it was an errant Islamic Jihad missile that didn't even land on the hospital, it landed in the parking lot, didn't kill 500, killed at most some dozens. All that's terrible, of course, but they were caught lying and trying to propagate this lie, and there's several other major examples like that as well. One analyst, the anonymous blogger Elder of Zion, who, in my opinion, is just about the best blogger on these issues out there. He does detailed, sophisticated analyses of many things. I strongly urge folks to follow him if you're interested in pro-Israel advocacy. He's done an analysis. I don't know if he's right. I don't know exactly how persuasive it is, but it's not impossible that that the total number of people killed by Israel, this was last month, so this is a month behind us, was probably closer to 17,000 rather than the 30,000, almost half of the official number. And here, of course, the elephant in the room, what's been left out, when Hamas reports these dramatic numbers of 32,000, they do not even pretend to break them down into militants versus civilians. So they like to suggest, and most of the anti-Israel activists out there just follow along with this, that Israel's killed 32,000 civilians. But of course, the IDF at this point, as of very recently, was claiming to have killed approximately 14,000 Hamas folks. So even if we take the 32,000 number, what we're talking about is 32,000 would be, and 14,000 of them are Hamas militants, active terrorists or fighters. You have a ratio of 14 to 18, which comes out to something like 1.3 civilians per militant. And for a little bit of context here, which anti-Israelists will never give you, if that number is remotely close to 1.3 to 1, 1.3 civilians for every militant, that would make it by far the greatest, most successful civilian to militant ratio in any urban war ever, right? Urban wars, civilian casualties are unavoidable. Most wars will have numbers like 3 civilians to 1 militant, or 5 or 7 or 9 to 1. Israel here, very possibly the ratio was closer to 1.3 to 1. That tells you a tremendous amount right there, especially in light of the circumstances we all know are in Gaza. We have an entrenched terrorist organization that's built hundreds of miles of tunnels under everything, that have militarized all institutions, schools, mosques, and hospitals, etc., hiding behind civilian shields, quite literally. In fact, even the thing that allegedly led them to reject the most recent ceasefire thing is Israel was allowing women, children, and old men to return to the north. This is what Israel was proposing. And Hamas is insisting that the young men go too, i.e. they're fighters, right? They want to mix their fighters in with the old men, the women, and the children there. So in these unbelievable circumstances where it's you would think literally impossible to target the Hamas militants who are surrounded by and underneath civilians, if Israel has accomplished a 1.3 to 1 civilian militant ratio in those circumstances, it's nothing short of a miracle. That alone is enough to refute the genocide charge as well, even if we accept the numbers of 32,000. even accepting those numbers, let's continue on that thread. So first step is we can question those numbers. They might not be accurate. They're unlikely to be accurate. The rate of casualties has actually increased dramatically. The war has largely been on pause in some respects for at least 2 months. The large bulk of these casualties came in the first 2 months of the war. Israel began bombing prior to its October 27th invasion in mid-October. By mid-December, in 2 months, they were claiming 20,000 had died. So in 2 months, allegedly 20,000 are dead. But the next 3 months, leading up to mid-March anyway, and even going into April now, only produces another 11 or 12,000. So the rate of death has plummeted. Again, exactly the opposite of what you would expect if this were some sort of genocidal campaign. So too, Hamas does not distinguish civilians from militants, as I mentioned earlier. They want people to believe, and this is how it's spread on campuses, that it's 32,000 civilians. Note a few things. Hamas fighters often fight in civilian clothes, which is a war crime. And so when they are killed, they will count them as civilians. As I mentioned, the IDF, as of a few days ago, is estimating they've killed 14,000 fighters. So again, even if it's 32,000, that would be 18,000 to 14,000 civilian to militant, a very low ratio. And again, remember the conditions under which they are fighting. Keep in mind, it is not genocide to kill enemy soldiers, combatants, militants, terrorists, whatever it is you want to call them, right? There is nothing wrong from the international law perspective in targeting and killing enemy combatants, and it is clear that a significant percentage of these casualties are enemy combatants. Hamas includes in its numbers, and this has been demonstrated in the past wars. Hamas, this is basically the fifth full-scale war that Hamas has triggered since it illegally took power in a violent coup back in 2007, I believe. And so in each of the wars, we've seen the same patterns with these inflated claims of casualty numbers, insisting they're all civilians, et cetera. And then after the war is over, researchers go back and carefully discover that it was all lies. And that's certainly what will happen after this war. May it be soon and victorious when this war ends. So Hamas includes many who were not killed by Israel. People who die of natural causes. Just put them on the list of casualties. That is estimated to be about 500 people per month would just die of natural causes in Gaza, of old age and illness and things like that. In 6 months, that means 3,000 of those casualties are attributable to natural deaths. There are, very hard to count, but many people who have been killed by Hamas and Islamic Jihad rockets falling short. The statistics show as of about mid-March, when I was doing the research for this, approximately 10 to 15% of the rockets that Hamas and Islamic Jihad are firing from Gaza fall short. They land in Gaza, and they kill people, such as the Al-Ahli hospital that we mentioned earlier. It's hard to know how many people have been killed by Hamas and Islamic Jihad rockets, but it's more than just a few. And those numbers, of course, will just get rolled into the casualty numbers as if Israel is responsible for that. So too, there have been many videos of Hamas firing on its own people, in particular in the context of aid convoys. As we know, Hamas tends to steal the aid as it comes in. And one of the ways they steal the aid is the people flock to the trucks and the Hamas guys with their guns shoot at them and shoot them down. And there have been multiple videos available, filmed by Gaza residents, some of whom are outraged at Hamas for this behavior. So how many of the casualties include the people that literally were murdered by Hamas? Hamas also suppresses dissent, often by execution. So, continuing, even assuming the numbers are approximately accurate, the unprecedented measures by the IDF to minimize civilian casualties, that's the reason civilian casualties are really so incredibly low, even if we accept these overall numbers. They do this, by the way, often at the cost of their own soldiers' lives. Here are some of the examples. They delayed the initial invasion to give time for civilians to evacuate from the north of Gaza. They announced where and when they would be evading, and they announced where and when they're going to be attacking to give civilians time to vacate. which of course also indicates to Hamas where the attack's coming from and gives the advantage to their enemies. They invaded instead of just carpet bombing, which was an option if genocide was the desire, that's what they would have done. Dropping leaflets, again, to forewarn of pending bomb runs, thus informing the enemies where they are targeting so the enemies can also get away. Making phone calls. Israel has maintains a massive database, which is, by the way, very expensive. It's got phone numbers of everybody in Gaza, and they set up these robocalls, not trying to sell you, stuff, life insurance or something like that, but these robocalls warning you to vacate because your building is going to be targeted. That's costs money, it costs time. They constantly have been creating safe zones and safe times, announcing there'll be no combat during certain hours of the day, announcing regions that would be safe so civilians could go there, and facilitating humanitarian aid at an incredible scale and scope. I defy you to name one other country that spends half of its war effort supplying its enemies during the war. It's stunning that this is, of course, a demand made of Israel. President Biden most recently demanding you must do more to get more aid in there. There's literally, what about all the Israelis suffering? Is Hamas providing aid to the Israelis who are suffering from the rockets from Hezbollah and Hamas? Is Russia providing aid to the Ukrainians? Is anyone demanding that? It's really quite an outrageous double standard. But in any case, Israel is complying and has been complying since the early stages of the war. All of these are literally unprecedented measures. Israel has been called by fair and impartial observers the most moral army in the world, and it is for these reasons. It makes unbelievable, unprecedented efforts to distinguish civilians and militants. So go just a few more minutes here. In summary, every single one of these measures, even on its own, disproves the genocide claim. Indeed, the reverse is true. Israel is creating a new standard for urban warfare for minimizing civilian casualties compared to militant casualties. All this while Hamas uses its citizens as human shields in hospitals, mosques, schools where they store weapons, etc., etc. So the conclusion is the only people responsible for mass death here is Hamas. Those levying the genocide charge against Israel are perpetrating an anti-Semitic, demonizing lie. Simple as that. All right. Let me go 3 more minutes just to introduce this lie, and then we'll take time for questions and conversations. I see the chat and Q&A, fairly large numbers in there. So let's give some time for that. This lie, which we won't get too far into tonight, but we'll just at least introduce it. Remember, the Jews arrived from Europe in the 20th century committing genocide, and the Palestinian or the Arabs who were not subject to genocide were instead subjected to ethnic cleansing here. You have a picture on the left, one of many famous pictures of Palestinian refugees vacating their villages and moving elsewhere. And you have on the right probably the single most important book. This is a 2000 book by Israel-hating Israel expatriate Ilan Pappé called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. It was published in 2006. This is the Bible for those making the ethnic cleansing charges. I can tell you right now, this book, you have never read like a higher density of lies per words in a text than this particular book, but it is quoted and cited endlessly as proving, so they claim, that the Israelis had premeditated intention of ethnic cleansing, that the Zionists, or they were Israel, the Zionists intended all throughout to push out the Arabs and take over their land. So that is the lie. The lie is applied not only to the years leading up to and including 1948, which is what Pape's book is about, but also in the years since. The claim is that Israel has a policy of ethnic cleansing, that they're pursuing and perpetrating the goal of removing the Palestinians from Israel and the territories. And it's in play now. In fact, many argued against relocating civilians from Gaza. So this anti-genocide move of the Israelis to protect civilians by moving them out of harm's way. The other side was constantly resisting that, claiming that that was ethnic cleansing to move Gazans. Even, Egypt has refused to open their borders to Gazans, which in fact is just an outrage on so many levels. The world is not outraged by it, which is another outrage. But clearly, under any other refugee circumstance, the world jumps to make space for it to help the refugees so they can avoid a war zone. They haven't been doing that for the Gazan. They want to keep them there. They refuse to let them move to safety, which is what Israel wants them to do, because they say it's ethnic cleansing. So this ethnic cleansing lie is a powerful one, both the 1948 version, and it's active and alive and well today here. Let's just go a tiny bit further. What's true is that 500 to 800,000 Palestinians, Arabs, left their homes from early 1948 onward and became the refugees, the Palestinian refugees. There are debates about the numbers, but all the major folks on both sides, usually they come up to something between 500 and 800,000. That's the typical number. But the key point that I want to mention, we'll do this one and just one more after this, is that in November of 1947, when the UN voted in favor of the partition agreement, there were 0 refugees at that moment, right? November of 1947, when Zionism reached this incredible point where the UN voted in favor of proposing a partition, there were 0 refugees. What does that tell you? That tells you that Zionism itself displaced nobody. The Zionists displaced nobody. There were 0 refugees in 1947 when the partition proposal was initially proposed. In fact, just the opposite. Zionism drew people in, drew Arabs in. There was wide-scale Arab immigration into Palestine through the early 20th century. The Jewish Zionists were developing the land, they were building an economy, and they were drawing people in. Very famous quote from RFK Sr. In the Boston Post in 1948, right then at the time. The Jews point with pride to the fact that over 500,000 Arabs in the years between 1932 and 1944 came into Palestine to take advantage of living conditions existing in no other Arab state. This alone refutes the lie. We have quite a bit more to say on that, which we'll do in part 2. Zionism displaced nobody. In fact, the opposite is true. It drew people in. This is not a program of ethnic cleansing. Next time, we'll talk a little bit about this famous, infamous book from time immemorial by Joan Peters. But I'll stop here tonight, and we have some time for questions, which I'll do my best. And stay tuned for part 2, because there's quite a bit more to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we have many questions. Many of them are focused around how do we respond to all the things you said tonight. So I'm going to start with one, an editorial in Rethinking Schools, part of the Zinn Education Project, asserts anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. What is the best response to this assertion?
We need a whole lecture on that subject. So Chai Mitzvah people, I have some ideas. And I started off today by saying I had this experience now 9 years ago in which I saw clearly that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So what makes this, and thank you for that question, what makes this a challenging point is, first of all, both terms need to be defined fairly carefully. What exactly is meant by anti-Zionism? What exactly is meant by anti-Semitism? It will turn out, and I'll give you that in a second. Once you define them, there are ways to be anti-Zionist that are not anti-Semitic, right? So it is possible to be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic. But in actual fact, de facto, we might say, most people who are anti-Zionists are anti-Semitic, right? And so the people who reject this will try to look at those narrow cases where it's possible to be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic and suggest that that somehow represents the movement as it manifests itself on campus. The default value, in my view, should be certainly the burden of proof of this argument should be the opposite direction. On the face of it, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. So if you want to argue that in some particular instance that some example of anti-Zionism isn't anti-Semitic, fine, go for it. Maybe you'll be able to do that. So in terms of defining the terms, I won't actually try to define anti-Semitic here, but anti-Zionism, what's important to note is people will sometimes use that term to mean I'm just very critical of Israel. I'm an anti-Zionist, I'm critical of Israel. And if that's all it means, well, that on its own, there's nothing anti-Semitic about that. Nobody's more critical of Israel than Israelis and many Jews. Criticizing specific policies or practices of Israel is perfectly legitimate. And criticizing the policies and practices of any group or organization or state or country is always perfectly legitimate. So if all you meant by it is, I have a lot of criticism of Israeli policies, okay, fine, that's not anti-Semitic. In practice, and this has now become blatantly clear, I was in a minority back in 2015, 16, suggesting this. It was a little bit hidden, but now it's post October 7th, even the last 2 years, in fact, it's clear. The anti-Israel movement on campuses used to be something like a pro-two-state solution movement. And so they would condemn Israel for occupying the West Bank because they wanted room for a Palestinian state. It wasn't such an anti-Israel movement. It really was more pro-Palestinian. It wanted to establish a Palestinian state. That's how it used to be, I think, for a number of decades. But starting about 20 years ago, with the rise of the BDS movement, it started shifting to something darker. It was clearly had gone fully to the dark side as of several years ago. I don't think people were seeing it unless you're following the campus like I do. And now everyone sees it. The anti-Israel movement on campus is not a two-state solution. In fact, they regularly chant, we don't want two states, we want 1948. It is an anti-Israel movement. They want to replace Israel with Palestine. That is a destructive movement. It's one thing to argue for two states, then you're saying the Jews have a state, and you don't like Israeli policies which don't support that, maybe. The Palestinians have a state, but the movement today and a large majority of campus advocates, when they call themselves anti-Zionism, what they mean by that is I need to destroy Israel. Israel should be destroyed. And that's what these lies help support. Why should it be destroyed? Because it's evil. It commits genocide and ethnic cleansing and settler colonialism. We didn't even get to that, right? And apartheid. We didn't get to that either. It is evil, so it needs to be destroyed. And on the face of it, there are 50 plus Muslim majority countries in the world. There are 22 or 3 Arab countries, part of the Arab League. There are, I don't know how many officially Christian countries, Christian majority countries, 100 in the world, something like that. The only one that is a problem is the Jewish one. That already tells you something. Half of the world's Jews live in this country, Israel. Of the other half, the significant majority of them support the country, feel connected to it, have family in the country, call themselves Zionists, etc. The overwhelming majority of Jews is invested in the Jewish state. If you want to call for the destruction of the Jewish state, that is going to call for the genocide or the ethnic cleansing of Jews in their one tiny postage stamp of a country in this world. So on the face of it, if anti-Zionism means the end of Israel, on the face of it, that's anti-Semitic. You're going to have to do some intellectual contortions to say that that's not anti-Semitic. So that's the short answer, by the way. You can easily do a 40-minute lecture, going into a lot of details on that there. But that's why anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, because in its actual manifest form on campuses, it's calling for the destruction of Israel, knowing that that will require tremendous violence. They're all calling for intifada all over campuses now. We know what intifada means. That's what they want. And they celebrated October 7th. Major campuses had massive rallies going on for weeks and months, celebrating that massacre on October 7th. That's what they have in mind when they're anti-Zionist, the mass murder of Jews. So if that's not anti-Semitism, then I don't know what is.
Thank you for that short answer. There are so many questions here that relate to what you just said. I'm going to pick one. How do we deprogram the younger generation who have been taught to be anti-Semites? Are they recoverable?
Oh, that's thank you for that question. And, there's no shortage of Jewish and pro-Israel groups that are grappling with that, trying to figure out strategies. I don't have particular expertise, so I will just give you a few I don't know, speculation. I don't know if that's the right word, but our problems are many and they are deep and they are many faceted and there's many fronts. Um, it starts in American Jewish, if I'm focusing on the United States, let's say in Western campuses, it starts in American Jewish identity. American Jews have become very diluted in their identity. The Orthodox, which is growing, are deeply Jewish in their identity, but everything below that, we are very assimilated. It's actually part of a sign of our overall success in the 20th century. We've assimilated. And when you assimilate, you become a lot like your surroundings. And lots of American Jews, they'll wear their high necklace or something like that, or their Star of David, and they feel Jewish. But the identity is competing with a bunch of other very appealing identities, including being American and being cool and being progressive, especially for the younger people. So we have this students arriving in college who know next to nothing about the history of the Jews, the history of Israel, um, Judaism as a religion, etc. It needs to start from the ground up. We need to invest in Jewish day schools that are affordable. Jewish day schools are crazy. They're totally unaffordable for the vast majority of people. They should be affordable for every Jewish family who wants it. We need to raise our kids with the education and with the strong identity that Judaism actually is a wonderful identity. We Jews stand for good things. We are actually good people. As I was demonstrating, even in war, we're taking care of enemy civilians, which is just in a way that no other country does. To instill the strong identity and the pride in being Jewish is the foundation, right? And that's been lacking for a long time. So Jewish students are arriving at campuses not invested in their own identity. That's certainly one part of it. So education, Jewish day schools. On the campus itself, I want to leave time for some other questions. There's a bunch of organizations doing wonderful work, advocacy work, educational work. I want to mention Stand With Us. I want to mention Students Supporting Israel, a very important grassroots movement. The Academic Engagement Network, which I'm affiliated with, is working on faculty on campuses. We have this whole other area, which is the sort of Western progressive ideology, which has taken over all of our institutions, including the campuses of the 20th centuries. It has many good motivations and accomplishes some good things, but it's incredibly antithetical to the Jews and to Israel. And so we need to consider our relationship to the progressive ideology. That itself needs a whole lecture. Let me just mention David Bernstein's book, Woke Anti-Semitism, on that subject. So I'll stop there so there's time for at least one or two more questions.
I think we have time for one more question. And one of the very good ones that, first of all, you've answered a lot of the questions that we have here with what
Oh,
you said.
good.
That's good. But a kind of an overarching question, which is a good one to take for our last one, not just on campus, but how would you go about trying to talk about anything that was mentioned today to someone who's set in their opinion against Israel and saying that Israel's to blame?
So I personally am a non-confrontational sort of person, which is unfortunate because we need to be confrontational. Jonathan Tobin, I think, just had an essay. It's time for Jews to get noisy and start protesting. We write angry letters, but we don't like to get in people's faces. We don't like to have angry rallies, unlike the other side. So I'm non-confrontational. I don't like to be the one that's at the BDS, student government BDS vote and making the arguments. I prefer to write and do lectures like this. That said, you know, we need people who will confront. What I understand from people who are much more comfortable getting in the trenches is that you're not going to change the mind of a committed hater. That's just not going to happen. These things are too deeply ingrained, and it's usually not worth your while. It may take a while to figure out whether is this person a committed hater. There's a whole spectrum. There's the committed haters. You're not going to change their minds. On campuses, anyway, you've got, I think, the majority of students, they don't know a whole lot. Hating Israel is actually cool on campus from the progressive ideology, unfortunately. So they're drawn to it. But those are the folks that you hope, hey, if we can have a conversation over coffee, here's some actual facts. And I respect your narrative. You got to, I hear what you're saying. And Palestinians, by the way, have suffered a lot over the decades. We don't have to deny that. We might disagree on the ultimate source or cause or reason for that suffering, but you can acknowledge that suffering and then start moving the person hopefully more towards the center, right? A little bit more. So knowing your stuff, being educated and not wasting your time on the committed haters, because that's not going to happen, but focusing on the ones that are on that side because they're pulled there and they just don't have enough knowledge to resist it. That would be the strategy. The hard question is, well, actually, I'm guessing I don't think it's all that hard to distinguish a committed hater from someone who's a little bit just tagging along. And the reason is, or the significant clue is, and this tells you a lot about the BDS movement, anyone who doesn't want to listen to your side is a committed hater, right? They don't, and that's what's going on campuses. They call it anti-normalization. They want to shut down pro-Israel speakers. They want to keep them from coming to campuses. We had a few people on this meeting tonight that were going to try to flood the meeting, to stop it. They don't want to hear that side. Well, that's what a committed hater is. If someone is willing to listen, then you've got an in. So that's maybe the way to distinguish it, but focus on the hangers-on, not on the committed haters.
Thank you. You've really given us so much interesting information tonight and so much to think about. I know I'm looking forward to part 2, and I hope everyone here is also. It was amazing, all the things that you helped us learn about. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. Our next Scholars Circle lecture features Dr. Olga Kirschbaum-Shirosky on Beyond the Front Lines, a quick guide to the Middle East after World War I. This lecture will be live on Wednesday, May 8th at 12:00 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you everyone for attending, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you very much. And remember, check out the new novel, Bright College Years, my website, andrewpessin.com. It's about how college used to be before it became crazy, and it's meant to contrast with today's state of things. So thank you for your attention, and I
Thank
appreciate
you
you being here.
again. Thank you.